The three essays which constitute this genealogy are, as regards expression, aspiration, and the art of the unexpected, perhaps the most curious things that have ever been written. Welcome to part 1 of this series on Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. This first part is meant as an introductory video to set you up for a solid understanding of whatever comes next. We will discuss the title of the work and Nietzsche's aims in writing it. In subsequent videos, we'll tackle the three essays that constitute Nietzsche's infamous Genealogy of Morals. If you want to be notified when these parts are released, kindly subscribe to the channel and click the bell button. And if you want more Nietzsche in the meantime, we have an entire video series dedicated to his Beyond Good and Evil. Link in the description. Without further ado, let's jump into the work that some people would consider Nietzsche's masterpiece. Part 1. The title. As with all of Nietzsche's works, we can learn much from the title alone. The full title of the work reads as follows: On the Genealogy of Morals, a polemic. The subtitle, a polemic, is often overlooked, but it tells us something important about the work as a whole. Nietzsche does not intend to play the role of the disinterested, objective scientist dispassionately unearthing the truth. No, this work is a polemic. This means Nietzsche has a goal in mind. It means he has opponents he will attack. Later on, we will see just which kind of opponent Nietzsche is referring to. The main title, On the Genealogy of Morals, tells us everything we need to know about Nietzsche's method. He will explore the concept of morality through a historical, genealogical lens. Literally, genealogy is the study of family trees and lineages. He will explore how our current concept of morality came to be throughout the lens of history. This is an unusual approach in philosophy. Most philosophers try to reason from eternal principles, regardless of contingent historical factors. Descartes used his method of doubt in order to try and find eternal truths. Kant sought a priori judgment. Schopenhauer contemplated the eternal will. Nietzsche's approach in the genealogy is the opposite of this. Nietzsche will reappreciate the role of history in the formation of ideas. This is in line with other ideas regarding objective truth and psychological constitution of the philosopher influencing his thinking. We elaborate on this in our series on Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. Genealogy is also different from broader history, in that in genealogy, only our own family is of importance. We make the family tree of our family and not from some other family. In the same way, Nietzsche will ignore huge swaths of history and focus on one particular family, the European Western philosophical tradition. He will explore those attitudes and cultural impulses that have led to our present state, just like you and I would make a family tree of our own families and not the family of someone else. In doing this, of course you are ignoring the countless families of other individuals, but that's the entire point. In this way, Nietzsche's genealogy really is a genealogy and not just a history of morality. In simpler terms, Nietzsche will take us back through time and explore why we have come to believe the things we believe in. And he will then ask the question, should we still believe in these things? Why? Or why not? Part 2. The goal. The genealogy is very much focused history. But, as always, Nietzsche also has a future in mind. Those who have watched our videos on Daybreak and Beyond Good and Evil will probably see where this is going. What is Nietzsche's endgame? Nietzsche is looking into the future. He wants to demolish the moralities of old and create a new morality. This is supposed to be done through a so-called transvaluation of all values. This transvaluation of all values is an important Nietzschean concept. He even planned a book with the title The Will to Power, the Transvaluation of All Values. But, sadly, the book could not be completed due to Nietzsche's mental breakdown. In short, Nietzsche will diagnose specific problems with the Christian morality which has dominated European philosophy for centuries, and he will argue for its opposite. The original German term for transvaluation is Umwertung, which has a connotation of to flip something on its head, a revolution, but in the literal sense, if you will. This transvaluation of all values is present in every single work of Nietzsche's, starting with Daybreak. The term itself is not mentioned much in the genealogy, but the underlying idea is still there, and ambitious readers should be aware of this. Throughout the genealogy, Nietzsche wants to convince us that we've been led astray by the Christian morality of self-sacrifice. To make his case, he will make a genealogical historical study of morality. By showing us how we've been duped, Nietzsche will imply, not specifically state outright, which road we should take instead. But keep in mind, Nietzsche did not write for the masses. Nietzsche does not envision a revolution in morality, at least not anytime soon. In Beyond Good and Evil, he speaks of the new philosophers of the future. In Zarathustra, he introduces the Übermensch. Nietzsche knows his writings will not sit well with the vast majority of people, but he does not write for the majority. He writes for the few. This concludes part 1 of this series on Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals. This first part was meant more as a broad introduction. In subsequent parts, we will dive deep into Nietzsche's text itself, starting with the first essay. In this second installment, we tackle the first of the 3 essays which constitute the genealogy. Simply titled Good and Evil, Good and Bad, this essay will be familiar to anyone who has read Beyond Good and Evil, or, of course, familiar to anyone who has watched our video series on the book. In fact, much of the genealogy is an extended explanation of points that were first made in Beyond Good and Evil. But Nietzsche also goes deeper on these topics in this work, so it does pay off to look at them in more detail. So, what is this first essay about? The origin of good and evil. The truth of the first essays the psychology of Christianity, the birth of Christianity out of the spirit of resentment, not, as is supposed, out of the spirit, in all its essentials a counter-movement, that great insurrection against the dominion of noble values. In the first essay, Nietzsche presents a narrative which has since become well known. Nietzsche asks the reader, how did morality come into being? Where do our concepts of good and evil come from? Immediately, this is a different approach from traditional philosophy, which concerned itself with seeking so-called objective moral truths. Objective in the sense that there is no historical component. They were looking for the good in itself. As we discussed in the first part, this is not Nietzsche's method. Nietzsche regards with suspicion all these metaphysical aspirations, as he calls them. Let's be realistic, Nietzsche tells us. let's work with what we've got. That is to say, let's work with history. Nietzsche presents a narrative in which mankind progressed from a pre-moral stage to a moral stage. That is to say, in the beginning, there was no morality in the conventional sense of the word. People simply did things without any moral judgment about them. Actions were either beneficial or detrimental. Things were not good or evil. However, the powerful in this pre-moral stage did designate things as good. This was the nobility or aristocracy affirming its own mode of existence. Simply put, whatever the strong did, how they acted, they themselves affirmed as good. Nietzsche speaks at length about these nobles. Nietzsche simply means the strong, those in power in any given society. The strong were good and the good were strong. Take, for example, the ancient Roman and Greek societies that idolized war, strength, and masculinity. The judgment good did not originate among those to whom goodness was shown. Much rather has it been the good themselves, that is, the aristocratic, the powerful, the high-stationed, the high-minded, who have felt that they themselves were good, and that their actions were good. That is to say, of the first order, in contradistinction to all the low-minded, the vulgar, and the plebeian. It was out of this pathos of distance that they first arrogated the right to create values for their own profit, and to coin the names of such values. Power, strength, good, they all meant the same thing in these pre-moral times. However, somewhere along the line, morality got invented. The slave revolt in morals. The revolt of the slaves in morals begins the very principle of resentment becoming creative and giving birth to values. A resentment experienced by creatures who, deprived as they are of the proper outlet of action, are forced to find their compensation in an imaginary revenge. At this point, Nietzsche introduces the term ressentiment. Most translations keep the original French term he used. Ressentiment is best explained by the famous parable of the fox and the grapes. Christians and Jews, during the days of the Roman Empire, were an oppressed, powerless people. When they did not succeed in taking the worldly, material power they desired, they instead changed their tune and made a virtue out of their lack of power instead. Like the fox in Aesop's fable, who cannot reach the grapes high up in the tree and then shrugs and says, the grapes were probably sour anyway. Who wants sour grapes? The powerless in society cope with their lack of power by convincing themselves that earthly power is not worth it, that power is evil. According to Nietzsche, this is where Christian slave morality took root. It has been a slow revolt, 2,000 years in the works. It was, in fact, with the Jews that the revolt of the slaves begins in the sphere of morals, that revolt which has behind it a history of 2 millennia and which at the present day has only moved out of our sight because it has achieved victory. However, it's important to keep in mind that both master and slave morality originate from the same source, from the desire to dominate, the desire to be strong, the desire to be powerful. Later on, Nietzsche will expand on this idea and introduce the concept of will to power. Those who occupy a powerless position in society do not claim to not want power out of a philosophical insight or rational decision. They want power and desire just like everybody else. The only difference is they can't get it in the real world, so they take refuge in an imaginary world, the world beyond, heaven, the Hinterwelt, and they decry worldly material power as evil. In this way, they can enact a spiritual kind of revenge against those who have power in the here and now. But the underlying motivation of both the Roman warlord and the Christian saint is the same: the will to power. This brings us to section 14 of the first essay. Written in the form of a dialogue, there is not much to elaborate on in a video like this. Rather, I highly recommend you read it for yourself. The dialogue is written in a comedic manner and wonderfully illustrates the major points Nietzsche made in the first essay. The dialogue serves as a fitting conclusion. It has sadly been overlooked in Nietzsche scholarship, perhaps because of its radical content and humorous style. But that's precisely why it's worth the trouble of reading it in full. It's an unrelenting attack on Christian morality, written in a mocking, satirical tone. The dialogue represents the artistic side of Nietzsche, how he uses drama and other creative styles of writing to drive his points home away from the usual, matter-of-fact, philosophical, argumentative writing. Later on, in section 16, Nietzsche concludes the first essay. "Let us come to a conclusion," he writes. "The two opposing values, good and bad, good and evil, have fought a dreadful 1,000-year fight in the world, and though indubitably the second value has been for a long time in the preponderance, there are not wanting places where the fortune of the fight is still undecisive. The symbol of this fight, written in a writing which has remained worthy of perusal throughout the course of history up to the present time, is called Rome against Judea, Judea against Rome. Hitherto there has been no greater event than that fight, the putting of that question, that deadly antagonism. Which of them has been provisionally victorious, Rome or Judea? But there is not a shadow of doubt. Just consider to whom in Rome itself nowadays you bow down, as though before the quintessence of all the highest values, and not only in Rome, but almost over half the world, everywhere where man has been tamed or is about to be tamed. This is very remarkable. Rome is undoubtedly defeated. The final section of the first essay is a build-up to the second essay of the genealogy. The second inquiry offers the psychology of the conscience, which is not, as people may believe, the voice of God in man. It is the instinct of cruelty that turns back after it can no longer discharge itself externally. Cruelty is here exposed for the first time as one of the most ancient and basic substrata of culture that simply cannot be imagined away. I regard the bad conscience as the serious illness which man was bound to contract under the stress of the most radical change which he has ever experienced. That change, when he found himself finally imprisoned within the pale of society and of peace. In the second essay of the genealogy, Nietzsche explores the concepts of autonomy, conscience, and free will. This is probably the most difficult of the three essays that constitute the genealogy. For that reason, we highly recommend you first watch our series on Daybreak. The explanation of what Nietzsche termed morality of custom will help you immensely when trying to understand this essay. Promises. In the opening paragraph of the essay, we are asked to think about the concept of a promise. What does it mean to promise something? A promise is something you say you will do in the future. So it consists of two parts. First, you say, I will, and then, at a later date, you actually do it. You commit to something. Nietzsche calls this the memory of the will. But there is a problem. We can't predict the future. What kind of guarantee is there I will be able to actually fulfill my promise? Between the original I will, I shall do, and the actual discharge of the will, its act, we can easily interpose a world of new strange phenomena, circumstances, veritable volitions, without the snapping of this long chain of the will. But what is the underlying hypothesis of all this? How thoroughly, in order to be able to regulate the future in this way? To see the distant as present and to anticipate it, to fix with certainty what is the end, and what is the means to that end. Above all, to reckon, to have power to calculate. How thoroughly must man have first become calculable, disciplined, necessitated, even for himself and his own conception of himself, that, like man entering into a promise, he could guarantee himself as a future. To be able to promise something means you are able to guarantee a certain kind of future in which you will be able to fulfill that promise. We must, in other words, do away with nasty surprises that life might throw at us, that will ruin and disrupt our plans. We must become calculable, dependable, responsible. We must make our environment calculable, but also ourselves. Groups of humans need to become calculable. We all have to be on the same page. We must become more like each other. To become dependable, we must become uniform. We must become the same as our neighbor. That task of breeding an animal which can make promises includes the more immediate task of first making man, to a certain extent, necessitated, uniform, like among his like, regular, and consequently calculable. So what is happening here? This is simply the birth of a kind of morality, a set of rules on how to behave. This first morality is dubbed the morality of custom. This creation of the morality of custom, this great prehistoric work, as Nietzsche calls it, has made man dependable, calculable. In other words, we find the first seeds of civilization in this morality of custom. In the morality of custom, what is good is simply adherence to the tradition or custom itself. Something is good because we have been doing it that way for years. The morality of custom is a constraining process, taking the raw human material and molding it into obedience to the herd. What is good is what follows tradition, and that which breaks tradition, or rebels against it, is bad. We explore the concept of morality of custom more deeply in our series on Daybreak. In fact, the following quotation is illustrative. What is tradition? A higher authority, which is obeyed, not because it commands what is useful to us, but merely because it commands. This morality of custom, what did it look like exactly? Nietzsche gives examples. In primitive times, the domain of morality included education and hygienics, marriage, medicine, agriculture, war, speech and silence, the relationship between man, and between man and the gods. Morality required that a man should observe his prescriptions without thinking of himself as individual. This long prehistoric work of the creation of a morality of custom, the constraining of human impulse, the making of a calculable human, this large, difficult work will bear a strange fruit. Bad conscience. The sight of suffering does one good. The infliction of suffering does one more good. This is a hard maxim, but nonetheless a fundamental maxim, old, powerful, and human, all too human. Nietzsche believes mankind is characterized by an instinctive pleasure for inflicting cruelty. However, when man is prevented from satisfying this drive outwardly, it will have to turn inward. This is what happens when a morality of custom has established itself. In the domesticating of man, in other words, in making him civilized, we are doing away with external shows of cruelty. Yet the drive for cruelty remains. It's a part of who we are. So, when we cannot be cruel to other humans, we must be cruel towards ourselves. Just how is this cruelty against ourselves manifested? It is manifested in our bad conscience. Enmity, cruelty, the delight in persecution, in surprises, change, destruction, the turning all these instincts against their own possessors. This is the origin of the bad conscience. It was man who, lacking external enemies and obstacles, and imprisoned as he was in the oppressive narrowness and monotony of custom, in his own impatience, lacerated, persecuted, gnawed, frightened, and ill-treated himself. It was this animal in the hands of the tamer which beat itself against the bars of its cage. It was this being who, pining and yearning for that desert home of which it had been deprived, was compelled to create out of its own self an adventure, a torture chamber, a hazardous and perilous desert. It was this fool, this homesick and desperate prisoner, who invented the bad conscience. So, in short, the bad conscience is the result of our desire to inflict cruelty, which cannot find an external object, and so turns in on itself. The bad conscience is a form of self-torture, but also a source of pleasure, because we enjoy inflicting suffering, even if we do not enjoy undergoing suffering. What does this mean for man? It means man is sick. But thereby he introduced that most grave and sinister illness from which mankind has not yet recovered, the suffering of man from the disease called man, as the result of a violent breaking from his animal past, the result, as it were, of a spasmodic plunge into a new environment and new conditions of existence, the result of a declaration of war against the old instincts which up to that time had been the staple of his power, his joy, his formidableness. Civilization requires us to give up our primal instincts, most importantly our instinct for cruelty. Then we internalize this instinct because it needs an outlet. The result is we inflict suffering upon ourselves. This kind of self-torture, the chaining of our instincts, results in a nasty feeling which we have come to call a bad conscience. What comes next? Next, we look for meaning for our suffering. What really raises one's indignation against suffering is not suffering intrinsically, but the senselessness of suffering. Of course, religion provides the meaning for our suffering. That will for self-torture, that inverted cruelty of the animal man, who invented the bad conscience so as to hurt himself after the natural outlet for his will to hurt became blocked. In other words, this man of the bad conscience exploited the religious hypothesis so as to carry his martyrdom to the ghastliest pitch of agonized intensity. Owing something to God, this thought becomes his instrument of torture. He apprehends in God the most extreme antithesis that he can find to his own characteristic and ineradicable animal instincts. He himself gives a new interpretation to these animal instincts as being against what he owes to God. If man naturally has a capacity for cruelty and violence, this will become turn the other cheek in religious teachings. If a man's natural instinct is to acquire resources and wealth, religion will turn this drive into a sin and call it greed. And, finally, even our existence itself becomes cause for concern. If man's natural instinct is to live, and live vigorously, religious doctrine will recommend an ascetic life, a life of withdrawal, and it will place greater importance on the world beyond than on the world of here and now. In this way, religion is a justification for the suffering man feels when his instinctive drives have become so internalized they cannot be externalized. The religious person turns away from the world and from himself. We see this with monks and ascetics. Christian saints and monks who live in monasteries, high up in the mountains, far away from the rest of the world. We see this also with Indian Brahmins and Sufi mystics. Nietzsche has a lot to say about these so-called ascetics. But that's the subject for the next video, when we tackle the third and final essay of the genealogy, entitled, What is the Meaning of Ascetic Ideals? But in the very fact that the ascetic ideal has meant so much to man, lies expressed the fundamental feature of man's will, his horror vacui. He needs a goal, and he will sooner will nothingness than not will at all. Welcome to part 4 of our discussion on Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. This video will deal with the third and final essay of the genealogy, entitled, What is the Meaning of Ascetic Ideals? If you haven't watched the previous parts, we highly recommend you do so before watching this one. With that said, let's jump in and see where the conclusion of the genealogy takes us. As it stands, we can quickly summarize the content of the previous 2 essays as follows. In the first essay, we saw how the slave revolt and morals overthrew the earlier morality of so-called nobles, which is simply another word for the powerful or the aristocracy. We saw how the concepts of good and evil gained a metaphysical, moral significance rather than just being descriptors of what is useful or practical. And we saw how Nietzsche used ancient Rome as an example of master morality and juxtaposed it with Christianity, which exemplifies slave morality. In the second essay, Nietzsche is more concerned with individual psychology. We saw how man's instinctive drive for cruelty was prevented from finding an external outlet. Why? Because in order to live in civilization, man needs to give up his desire for exhibiting cruelty. But if this desire cannot be discharged outwards, it will be discharged inwards. This was the birth of the bad conscience, simultaneously a source of pleasure, but also a source of torture. The bad conscience is man's instinct for cruelty turned on himself. What happens is that man inflicts suffering upon himself and, consequently, needs to find meaning in this suffering in order to make it bearable. This meaning of suffering is religion, and in the Christian faith we find the most well-developed doctrine of the meaning of suffering. So much so that in Christianity, Not the material world of the here and now is of supreme importance, but the world beyond, the afterlife. Note also how in Christianity it is believed that man is born in sin. Man is born with a bad conscience right from the start. The third essay, the subject of this video, will deal with the grand conclusion of the genealogy. In the third and final essay, Nietzsche explores the psychology of the ascetic. The ascetic is the priest or monk who voluntarily inflicts suffering upon himself by not eating, not drinking, being chaste, avoiding pleasure and seeking pain. The saint or holy person in Christianity represents the perfection of the ascetic ideal, and it is these three things, the saint, the ascetic, and the ideals of the ascetic, that Nietzsche is primarily concerned with in this essay. The essay is notoriously hectic, as Nietzsche jumps from one point to the next and tackles such a wide range of phenomena from Wagner's art to Schopenhauer's philosophy, from Plato to Homer, from Kantian aesthetics to Indian priests, that summarizing it is effectively impossible. In this video, we will try and uncover the main thread throughout the essay and explain it in clear language without necessarily following each and every tangent Nietzsche goes on. One sentence keeps coming back again and again throughout the essay. What is the meaning of ascetic ideals? Throughout the essay, Nietzsche gives several examples in which aesthetic ideals manifest themselves in different types of men. The ascetic ideal in the artist, the philosopher, the aesthete, the priest, etc. But even though the question keeps coming back, Nietzsche has given the answer already in section 1 of the essay, in the form of an aphorism. Man will sooner will nothingness than not will at all. This is the central thought that should be kept in mind as we go on, that the ascetic ideal is somehow linked with a will to nothingness. What does that mean exactly? We'll have to find out. As Nietzsche explained in the foreword to the genealogy, an aphorism properly coined and cast into its final mold is far from being deciphered as soon as it has been read. On the contrary, it is then that it first requires to be expounded. Of course, for that purpose, an art of exposition is necessary. The third essay in this book provides an example of what is offered, of what in such cases I call exposition. An aphorism is prefixed to that essay. The essay itself is its commentary. With all of this in mind, let's explore the genealogy's final essay, the ascetic ideal. The ascetic ideal is the conviction that this world, the material world, the here and now, is to be discarded as evil at worst or irrelevant at best. Instead, the ascetic ideal praises some kind of hinterwelt, literally beyond world, which is the true object of existence. Christians, for example, believe in heaven or the afterlife. For Schopenhauer, this hinterwelt becomes the world as will, and for Kant, the hinterwelt is the thing in itself. The right course of action for the ascetic is therefore to negate the material world. The ascetic achieves this by living in poverty, being chaste, fasting, avoiding pleasure, and seeking pain. However, Nietzsche's point in this essay is that this ascetic ideal will take on new forms, new manifestations throughout history. But even more importantly, Nietzsche shows us how apparently different manifestations all result from the same drive towards self-denial in the material world with the hope of a better outcome in some other world or hinterwelt. The question then becomes, what lays beneath this drive to self-denial? But first, Nietzsche explores the ascetic ideal as it manifests itself in 4 classes of people: artists, philosophers, priests, and scholars. It is with the ascetic priest that we find the ultimate kind of asceticism. The priest, or rather the monk, who gives up all earthly pleasures, who denies himself completely. The priest truly lives an ascetic life. But what does that mean? The idea is the value of our life from the standpoint of the ascetic priests. This life, then, together with the whole of which it is a part, nature, the world, the whole sphere of becoming and passing away, is placed by them in relation to an existence of quite another character, which it excludes and to which it is opposed, unless it deny its own self. In this case, the case of an ascetic life, life is taken as bridge to another existence. The ascetic treats life as a maze, in which one must walk backwards till one comes to the place where it starts. Or he treats it as an error, which one may, nay, must refute by action. Nietzsche's Psychology of the Priest takes up the bulk of the third essay, and his treatment of the ascetic priest is paradoxical. On the one hand, Nietzsche believes the priest confirms those values which Nietzsche deems to be degenerative and sick: self-denial, life-denial, negative virtue. Yet, on the other hand, Nietzsche clearly admires the willpower it takes to achieve this priestly ideal. You cannot, in fact, but admire the counterfeiter dexterity with which the stamp of virtue, even the ring, the golden ring of virtue, is here imitated. They have taken a lease of virtue absolutely for themselves. They stalk about in our midst as living reproaches, as warnings to us, as though health, fitness, strength, pride, the sensation of power were really vicious things in themselves, for which one would have some day to do penance, bitter penance. This paradox is easily solvable, though, because a major point of the essay is that the priest is simply, secretly, in a backhanded way, striving for power, because right after the aforementioned quote we read the following: "Oh, how they themselves are ready in their hearts to exact penance, how they thirst after being hangmen." Guilt and bad conscience. In the previous essay, we saw how humanity internalized guilt and suffering and called it a bad conscience. We also saw how this is a kind of internalized cruelty, a cruelty which we inflict upon ourselves. And then religion comes along and tells us a story for how our suffering is actually meaningful and thus justified. In the third essay, Nietzsche exposes the role of the priest in the story. The priest justifies the feelings of guilt felt by the masses from a position of social authority. The priest leads from the front in the glorification of suffering, in the glorification of life denial, the glorification of the hinterwelt of the world beyond. The priest empowers the weak by assigning the highest value to their sufferings, while at the same time celebrating and discharging his own power in being at the cause of such a transformation. In other words, the priest soothes the weak and delights in the power he is granted when the weak, in turn, give him authority over their moral well-being. In this way, the priest celebrates the will to power for himself, but denies it when engaging with the masses. This is the paradoxical nature of the priest, and also why Nietzsche both hates and admires the priest. Ascetic ideals in science. But we're not done yet. In the final quarter of the essay, after having traced the ascetic ideal all the way through examples of artists, philosophers, and priests, Nietzsche discusses scholars, or scientists, as we would say today. Aren't scientists, these dispassionate searchers for truth, finally liberated from this desire for asceticism. Modern science, which, like the genuine reality philosophy which it is, manifestly believes in itself alone, manifestly has the courage to be itself, the will to be itself, and has got on well enough without God, another world, and negative virtues. Of course, Nietzsche will argue that, despite their vocal protestations to the contrary, scientists or scholars still fall victim to the very same drives and instincts as the priests. They are not opponents of the ascetic ideal, even if they say they are. But why? These solitaries and deniers of today, these fanatics in one thing, in their claim to intellectual cleanness, these hard, stern, continent, heroic spirits who constitute the glory of our time, all these pale atheists, anti-Christians, immoralists, nihilists, these skeptics, these supreme idealists of knowledge, in whom alone nowadays the intellectual conscience dwells and is alive. In point of fact, they believe themselves as far away as possible from the ascetic ideal, do these free, very free spirits. And yet, if I may reveal what they themselves cannot see, for they stand too near themselves, this ideal is simply their ideal. They represent it nowadays and perhaps no one else. They themselves are its most spiritualized product, its most advanced picket of skirmishes and scouts, its most insidious, delicate, and elusive form of seduction. If I am in any way a reader of riddles, then I will be one with this sentence. For some time past there have been no free spirits, for they still believe in truth. A belief in truth is exposed here as the latest manifestation of the ascetic ideal. On its face, this is a very strange thing to say. So, let's explore this topic further. The belief in an objective truth is simply a roundabout way of believing in metaphysics. Without realizing it, the scientist believes in a foundation which finds justification outside of science. In other words, science does not believe in itself alone, even if they don't realize this themselves. Scientists have a will to truth. They work in the realization of this ideal, the idea that truth is better than untruth. Historically, this belief was well founded to the point of being religious dogma. In the past, truth was equated with being, which was equated with the good. This is Plato's legacy in Western philosophy, a legacy which then transformed into the Christian ideal. In the Bible, we even find Jesus as saying, "I am the truth." But the scientist does not believe in God or metaphysics. The scientist is concerned with this world and not the next, not some metaphysical hinterwelt or transcendental God. But this leaves the scientist in a very strange position. On the one hand, he believes in the objective value of some kind of metaphysical truth, but on the other hand, he swears off any religious or metaphysical pretensions. Turn in this context to the most ancient and most modern philosophers. They all fail to realize the extent of the need of a justification on the part of the will for truth. Here is a gap in every philosophy. What is it caused by? Because up to the present, the ascetic ideal dominated all philosophy, because truth was fixed as being, as God, as the supreme court of appeal, because truth was not allowed to be a problem. Do you understand this allowed? From the minute that a belief in the God of the ascetic ideal is repudiated, there exists a new problem, the problem of the value of truth. The will for truth needed a critique. Let us define by these words our own task. the value of truth is tentatively to be called in question. The will to truth. Nietzsche is not saying that truth is impossible. Rather, he accuses scientists of placing a certain value on truth while simultaneously not believing in the conditions that would make the valuation justified. The scientist, someone who studies the physical world, does not believe in metaphysics. Yet a belief in metaphysics is necessary to underpin a truth value that can justify the scientific project. In simpler terms, the scientist must believe that truth is better than untruth. This is not a scientific claim, but a metaphysical one. Yet the scientist will say he does not believe in metaphysics whatsoever. This is where Nietzsche's accusation comes in. The scientist does believe in a certain kind of metaphysics, even if he says he does not. This implicit will to truth is then, for Nietzsche, simply another manifestation of the ascetic ideal, the very thing the scientist claims to be against. But what forces it into that unqualified will for truth is the faith in the ascetic ideal itself, even though it take the form of its unconscious imperatives. Make no mistake about it, it is the faith, I repeat, in a metaphysical value, an intrinsic value of truth, of a character which is only warranted and guaranteed in this ideal. It stands and falls with that ideal. Nietzsche makes his case further by claiming that modern science and religious asceticism are each other's firmest allies, because at the end of the day, they both seek to negate man and they both seek to negate life. He uses the example of the Copernican revolution, the revelation that the Earth is not the center of the universe. Has there not been since the time of Copernicus an unbroken progress in the self-belittling of man and his will for belittling himself? Alas, his belief in his dignity, his uniqueness, his irreplaceableness in the scheme of existence is gone. He has become animal, literal, unqualified, unmitigated animal. Since Copernicus, man seems to have fallen on to a steep plane. He rolls faster and faster away from the center. Whither? Into nothingness? Into the thrilling sensation of his own nothingness? Well, this would be the straight way to the old ideal. Nothing has really changed, according to Nietzsche. Christianity has told us we are nothing compared to God, that the material world is but a preparation, that mankind is really nothing special, sinful even. Schopenhauer said mostly the same thing. Mankind is just the manifestation of a cruel, irrational will to life, and non-existence is preferable to existence. And now, science comes along and kicks man off his pedestal. We are not the center of the universe. We do not even have a special place in the animal kingdom. As Darwin has shown, we are simply animals, genes, DNA. Only quantitatively do we differ from the other animals, not qualitatively. In the end, we are simply evolved monkeys and nothing more. Nietzsche even accuses the scientist of finding enjoyment in this debasement of mankind, just like the priest before him. All science, and by no means only astronomy, all science nowadays sets out to talk man out of his present opinion of himself, as though that opinion had been nothing but a bizarre piece of conceit. You might go so far as to say that science finds its peculiar pride, its peculiar bitter form of stoical ataraxia in preserving man's contempt of himself. Where does this leave us? Suffering and meaning. Nietzsche has shown that the projects of philosophy, science, religion, academia, morality all amount to the same thing. They are all reformulations of the same ascetic ideal. But why do we humans so persistently seek that which causes our suffering, that which causes our debasement, which feeds our self-hatred? Why is the ascetic ideal an ideal in the first place? Something we should strive towards as if it's good? The short answer is because the ascetic ideal, even though it causes us great suffering, nevertheless gives meaning to our existence. Let's go back to the most important sentence of the essay, the first aphorism out of which the rest of the essay follows. Man would rather will nothingness than not will at all. In the final section of the essay and of the genealogy as a whole, we read, "If you accept the ascetic ideal, the animal man had no meaning. His existence on earth contained no end. What is the purpose of man at all was a question without an answer. The will for man and the world was lacking. Behind every great human destiny rang as a refrain a still greater vanity." The ascetic ideal simply means this, that something was lacking, that a tremendous void encircled man. He did not know how to justify himself, to explain himself, to affirm himself. He suffered from the problem of his own meaning. To what purpose do we suffer? Man, the bravest animal and the one most inured to suffering, does not repudiate suffering in itself. He wills it, he even seeks it out, provided that he is shown a meaning for it, a purpose of suffering. Not suffering, but the senselessness of suffering was the curse which till then lay spread over humanity, and the ascetic ideal gave it a meaning. The ascetic ideal provides us meaning for our suffering, and man needs meaning more than anything else. It was, up till then, the only meaning, but any meaning is better than no meaning. You could say Nietzsche's entire project consists of finding a better meaning, a new meaning, one that does not cause more suffering in the process as the ascetic ideal does. But this project of creating a new meaning is not for the genealogy. As we said in the very first part of this series, the genealogy is concerned with history. Therefore, Nietzsche does not tell us what this new meaning might entail. Instead, the genealogy ends with the following sentence: "A will for nothingness, a will opposed to life, a repudiation of the most fundamental conditions of life, but it is and remains a will. And to say at the end that which I said at the beginning, man will wish nothingness rather than not wish at all." Might we discover, or even create, something better to strive towards? That will be Nietzsche's great challenge to us. But that is the subject for another video. With this will to nothingness, we end our series on the genealogy of morals. We sincerely hope you found this series useful in your own learning process. This was a long and hard project to realize. If you like what we do and you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing, liking, and commenting. And if you want more people to see this, sharing this video is the best thing you could do. We are not done with Nietzsche yet, so please subscribe if you want more. And above all, thank you for watching.